Well, still with me here is Laura Trott, former advisor to David Cameron, and Joe Owen for the Institute for Government. We were just talking before we went to Vicky, Laura, about Jeremy Corbyn's statement immediately after the vote that he's not necessarily going to pick up the gauntlet.
Yes, he made a promise to the so-called Rebel Alliance of Lib Dems, Greens and others that they would get the priority would be to get this bill through, which stops a no-deal Brexit before agreeing to any general election. There's also the factor of the date. So Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party are worried that if they agree to a general election, which is, remember, what they've been calling for a long period of time, Boris Johnson would actually push that post-Brexit to mean that Brexit would happen while a general election was taking place.
Although he's saying, Joe, that I want to go back to the European Council on the 17th of October and present my terms for Brexit, that would suggest that he still thinks he can get a deal, but he wants to be the man putting the deal for the UK.
Exactly. An early election allows Boris Johnson to still say October the 31st, do or die, I want a deal, but I'm also prepared to do no deal. So it keeps his kind of campaign promises from the leadership campaign kind of intact. No options have been ruled out. The question will be whether he can get the legislation through tomorrow. I mean, it looks, as I say, unlikely that Jeremy Corbyn will go through the 2/3 route. There is another option other than just going for the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, which is to introduce a short piece of legislation that sets aside the Fixed-Term Parliament Act and the need for a 2/3 majority, and that they could use to specify a date that would allow Jeremy Corbyn at least to be kind of reassured that it wasn't just a debt being set.
And they'd only need a simple majority for that.
And they would only need a simple majority for that.
Vicky Young made a very important point to me in Blackford there, that for all the assurances that the opposition parties and the rebel Tories are trying to get to stop no deal, I mean, the simple fact is you cannot bind the hands of a future government.
Absolutely, yes. So unless Jeremy Corbyn is extremely confident that he's going to win the next general election, which on current numbers I don't think he should be, then actually anything that he gets through Parliament now, which rules out no deal, is essentially null and void, because it could be quickly counteracted by a new government.
Just on the sequencing, we now have two motions that are going down tomorrow. Which takes precedent?
I think they've got control of the order paper, so any business after 3 p.m. Goes over to the bill that we've seen the draft of, the EU Withdrawal Bill number 6. So
would Boris Johnson's motion under the terms of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, would that have to wait until all this is out of the way on Friday?
So he seemed to suggest that he wanted to see what happened in the Commons. So if the Commons passed the legislation, because remember, this is just for them to take control of the order paper, and the Commons are looking to ram it all through tomorrow. So they've specified that they want a vote at 5 o'clock on second reading, and then they want another vote at 7 p.m. So they want to push it all through tomorrow. So we could be looking at the big vote for general election being right at the end of the day, kind of this time tomorrow.
And remember, there's also meant to be a spending review tomorrow, ironically. So when and whether that's going to happen is all very much up in the air.
Quite. I mean, there is a cabinet meeting first thing in the morning. Yeah. You're a former special advisor to David Cameron. What will the mood be like? What will they be thinking?
I mean, I think they've been prepared for this. The numbers were looking like, I mean, I think this is a slightly bigger defeat than they were expecting, but they were expecting to lose. So the cabinet will prepare for this. They would have agreed this course of action. So I think it's going to be heads down and getting on with the strategy that they've all decided on previously.
Yeah, it's been quite an odd week already, because there's a certain amount of, I was saying earlier, a certain amount of game theory going on both sides. Yeah. They're trying to double guess what the others want. Does Dominic Cummings and his team, Boris Johnson's team, do they have more tricks up their sleeve, or are we at the nub of it now, that it has to be a general election?
Well, I think we've seen a lot of the kind of tricks that exist being talked about already with regards to this bill. I mean, one of the big tricks the government's always had up its sleeve is controlling parliamentary time. That's obviously gone out of the window for tomorrow.
Lords already, a number of amendments being put down in the Lords to try and filibuster this out.
Exactly, the Lords trying to filibuster it. There were talks about about the government just trying to withhold royal assent, and we saw that in the vote today that's just passed, the rebels trying to guard against that by putting in provisions that would say that the House could carry on sitting essentially on a day where royal assent, when both parts of the House, the Lords and the Commons, have passed the piece of legislation they've got through. So they're all thinking about exactly what the other side might do to block it. But ultimately, we would still come back to what happens with Brexit. I mean, there's still a ticking clock, right? And there are three options: deal, no deal, or revoke. You can extend as many times, but ultimately that question's not going to go away. And January, the end of January, which is what the extension legislation talks about as a kind of first suggestion to the EU, doesn't give you a huge amount of time to resolve those questions.
I wonder what goes on in Brussels tomorrow, because David Frost, the special Europe advisor for Boris Johnson, is back in Brussels, back talking to the Commission. There's a lot going on tomorrow. The European ambassadors are back. They're going to unveil documents which will talk about no deal and preparedness and all the rest of it. Do they look at what's happening here and think, actually, tonight the risk of no deal has gone up, or do they think perhaps it's gone further away?
I think they would probably think overwhelmingly that Boris Johnson won't be able to get a revised deal through the House, actually, because the problem that Theresa May always had post the decision to call a general election and afterwards is that she wasn't able to get something through. So whenever she was negotiating with Brussels, her hand wasn't that very strong because she couldn't deliver her own side. Now, all the signals that this will be sending to Brussels is that Boris Johnson, unfortunately, has the same problem.
Yeah, and one EU diplomat did say today, once Philip Lee had walked across the chamber and joined the Liberal Democrats, well, what's the point in negotiating? I mean, he doesn't even have a working majority anymore. Exactly. It's over.
Yeah, I think, the EU will want to know that if they negotiate, if they move and make any concessions, however big or small, that those concessions will be enough to get the deal through. And actually, in some respects, they might be looking at this saying, this leads to a general election. Actually, finally, there'll be a rebalancing of the arithmetic, because as it stands, this Parliament seems like it's unable to pass any kind of positive thing about Brexit, about what it does want, but very good at knocking options down when they get presented to them.
Just a word on Jeremy Corbyn. I wouldn't expect you to strategise for the Labour leader, but he's in a bit of a bind here, because I understand he's put that forcibly across tonight that he doesn't want to risk crashing out with no deal by going for an election. But at the same time, I mean, we saw some of the reaction from his Momentum supporters tonight. They're bang up for an election. Yes. And he doesn't want to look frit.
No, he doesn't at all. And also, for the people around the leader, there's a lot of advantages to going to a general election in quick order, because he would get to decide what the manifesto is. He wouldn't have to go through the party processes that otherwise he would. And he could also potentially do a slightly harder Brexit position if it was decided by the leader's office rather than the wider party. Jeremy Corbyn, remember, is not someone who is pro the European Union. He's quite a Brexiteer, but just is held back by his party. So it is a difficult dilemma for him. But ultimately, he has to be seen to want an election. It's absolute suicide for an opposition leader not to.
And that is going to be the most interesting thing from a Labour perspective, is what is on the manifesto. Because John McDonnell told me a few weeks ago they decided, in terms of any deal that came back from Boris Johnson, that they wanted a referendum on it, that the people should have a say on whatever the deal was, but they didn't have a strategy on what the election campaign would be, or whether they would campaign for Remain.
Yeah, exactly. It's always been quite difficult, it's fair to say, to pin down exactly what the Labour position is with regards to a referendum and what may come up in an election.
But one would presume if they're campaigning for Remain in a referendum, they'd be campaigning for Remain in an election campaign, wouldn't they?
Yeah, well, I mean, presumably an election
you
campaign...
couldn't sit on the fence anymore, is the point I'm making.
Yeah, I think it will be difficult. I mean, one of the questions will be how much about this election will be Brexit, because we had this really peculiar experience in 2017, if you remember, where everything was about Brexit, and then the campaign began and it barely got mentioned. There was dementia tax, there was nationalisation, and both parties sought to fight on their visions beyond Brexit. And it would seem very weird if that happened now, given all that's happened over the last few months, but it could still happen.
I mean, there is the element of the Brexit party in this whole equation, but does the next 5 weeks, does it boil down to effectively a de facto referendum again on Brexit? And do people get a straight choice between a true blue Brexit, if you will, and a Labour Remain position?
Well, I think that's an interesting way of positing it, in that what the Tories will try and do is to present themselves as the Brexit party, and therefore try and peel as many votes away from the Brexit party as they possibly can. Labour's issue is they're being eaten up by the Liberal Democrats because they have the clearer Remain position, and therefore are...
So they both have the same problem in a sense.
Exactly, but actually the Conservatives are, I think, being better at setting out an electoral stall than Labour are at the moment. And so the left is therefore slightly split, giving the opportunity for the Tories potentially to come through the middle if they manage to hoover up the rest of that Brexit vote.
So much to discuss in the weeks ahead. Laura, Joe, thank you very much for your company this evening.